some exegetes will water down the full force of this passage by talking about psychological imbalance. But the Lord had divine knowledge also, and he knew exactly what forces were at work. Here, when it talks about unclean spirits, and many of them, that's exactly what it means. Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich saw this scene in vision, and she was given an intuition as to why they wanted him to go from there, and what this bizarre situation was all about, which is not sufficiently evident in the text as it is to give an understanding of what actually would be interpreted initially as an unfair treatment of the livelihood of these swineherds. After all, they lost 2,000 pigs, just like that. Well, apparently, what comes through in what she saw is that there had been unjust gains going on, and that these were therefore not licitly owned. And so he knew things, and they knew that he knew things, and that's perhaps the complete background to why they wanted him to go away. He was uncomfortable to have in town. With regard to what happened, we have a mention of the abyss, which means a bottomless place. The pit, a in Greek, is negative, and bisos is the root of depth, hole, something which has no bottom. And therefore it's a way of talking about hell. And I want to dwell on the issue of what the Lord was doing here, because it's only the tip of the iceberg. The whole of his ministry had to do with what in miniature was happening here. Driving back these enemies of mankind to where they belong, and opening glory for man who can't get to heaven until it's put right. That is, in a sense, the backdrop to all that we do in Christianity. We glorify God, but we also save mankind, and that means we save them from something. All the missionary impetus of Christianity throughout the centuries is based on that, an urgency. Now, I want to zoom into this because there's more going on in our town than meets the eye. Just in this last weekend, by chance, some who are here now, we had been discussing things on Saturday with regard to what has come out of exorcism. And because of what came out of the conversation that we had after the Mass we had there in Carlingford on Saturday, I decided to do some research. And it's true. None other than Judas Iscariot has come to the fore in exorcism, and with greater detail than I was aware until I was told. And it's worth looking into if you're that way inclined, because there's a lot now available, even immediately, by knowing how to Google material. And so I did. And I found that there was, in the mid-70s, a series of extremely powerful and puzzling exorcisms going on in Switzerland. And one of the very interesting parts of it is the fact that Judas Iscariot, who has managed to get into this possessed person with others, and they're named, is obliged, against his will, to declare certain things. And what is coming forth is this. What in the mid-70s was happening in mid-Europe and going round the world very quickly was not just of human origin. The demons are very much involved in what goes on earth when it pertains to eternal salvation, and the means to eternal salvation the one true church, which of course they recognize and know. They can tell immediately when a host is validly consecrated and when it's not. You know, they have to have a certain quantity of consecrated hosts every month for their celebrations, and they can't be fooled. Now, I wasn't aware actually how much infiltration had been going on until I quietly this afternoon looked in depth at what came out of this very dramatic exorcism, where about 8 priests were involved, top level. And I won't go into all the detail because it's there if you want to go into it yourself, but I will indicate that some of them you will be secretly aware of it through the sense of the faithful that you have already, but you won't be able to vocalize it. That's why it was interesting to hear it coming from down under. Judas, who was what he was, and close to the bottom, the top of the bottom, because of his situation. A bishop, and that's insisted upon, who was in perfect hatred and vengeance, and collaborating with Lucifer and Beelzebub to do the maximum amount of damage. And it would seem that he has a particular interest in what regards precisely what he is, out of envy. He's lost it, and therefore he has this hatred. Bishops and priests, and all that goes with the whole structure that they're responsible for. He is able, apparently, as a human demon, to do harm. He's also interested in suicide. And suicide is not just human in its factors. There's a push. Alas, somebody I knew well enough just committed suicide again on Friday, and succeeded this time. A young man, and a man of faith too. But these are little pushes which these demonic forces just shove at the right time, get them in weakness, adding to the confusion that's in the mind already. But I don't want to go into that one this night. I want to go into the other one. It's come through with a certain clarity this time in this series of exorcisms that specific things which were not positively willed by the Holy Spirit, but were hugely pushed and in part inspired by these demonic forces that wish to attack both God and man in that very crux of the encounter, which is the Eucharistic life of the Church, its very centre. And so it came out that there's more going on than meets the eye. I'll mention a few. The way in which Holy Communion was pushed in a fairly short time to be received under new modalities and in a new atmosphere was a great victory for the wrong side. Moreover, a large number of graces and blessings are being lost in the very act of receiving the body of the Lord, when in practice it is not being received or given in the way positively, I say positively willed by its giver. There was a great interest in the demonic forces to separate the notion of consecration from the notion of distribution. It had not been the positive will of the giver of this gift par excellence of himself to mankind until the end of time, that it should be handled by any but the hands that he himself had set apart for only that, consecrated hands. Part of a tradition which is actually mystical in tendency, understood such by all the generations, and still so in the East, and in the rites under Rome, but of the Eastern sort. There are quite a few churches who are in that situation, uniates. The notion, that is, that all that touches God is also consecrated. A chalice, a corporal, a purificator, a paten, a chalice, a tabernacle, and of course the hands themselves, which then will not handle anything less than God, and therefore the consecration of the person is involved. Therefore, the natural identification of the two when it comes to separation from anything that would detract from that in totality of consecration of heart, mind and body. Hence, the natural orientation towards celibacy. Now, there are also other things. The way in which the positive will of God is indicated by the common heritage of the Church in East and West in all rites, until recently, of carrying on what was part of the earliest centuries in their practice of facing God together, was not questioned until elements of the liturgical movement saw the advantages from certain points of view of having more communication through facing the people. But it was not from a desire to reproduce that of the early church. There is no question but that it was always, as church indicates in its architecture from the earliest paleographic, Paleo-Christian architecture and anything that we can find, that it was always in that mode, in East and West. Now this bit here was of great interest to the demonic forces because of the huge number of consequences that followed in having the contact between the celebrant and the people happening on the human and horizontal level after the first part of the celebration. Now, this might not seem as important as it is because we're used to it, but actually it's a massive difference. Now, there were other things being pushed also. The discontinuation of 2 millennia of practice of avoiding that any possible source of human distraction be there in the sanctuary area. Linked with the will of the Lord positively, and in this case absolutely, that the priesthood be limited to those who represented his humanity in his masculinity. In practice, the distraction caused by human beings not dressed in such a way as to hide themselves in liturgical vestments. The alb conceals, but to have people dressed in the same dress that they have before coming in is not the same. It takes away from the sacrality and the otherness, and also invites attention to the human. then surprisingly other elements also come out. The enthroning of God, its pushing aside so as not to be the centre of attention, was also hugely pushed by hostile forces of a satanic nature, in such a way that visibly the house of God would eventually be seen as a place of human encounter. Then there is an unexpected one in the way in which, by subtle means, the power and authority of the one commissioned and ordained to preach the word of God would be hugely diminished by the progressive destruction of nearly all the pulpits of the church. Because in practice, when a whole congregation is obliged to look upwards, and therefore above the heads of others, they are also in two ways obliged to respect and look up to the one who is proclaiming with authority, and to think only about the word and not about other human beings down below, is something which has a huge effect, because actually the preacher, trained to use his voice and from a place of authority, has far more power, and felt to be so, than somebody standing on the same level and using the same instruments as are used by lay people in our day. Now, there's more going on here than meets the eye. It's not one, but several intertwined factors pushed by satanic forces, which are having the global effect of what? The human taking the place of the authority of the divine. And there's one big one which flows from this as well, and I finish with it. It's that there is also a huge conspiracy from satanic forces to make sure that that authority is lost by a hidden but effective mode of making it impossible and completely incorrect to address what gave all preaching throughout the centuries its force and authority anyway. The very fact that we're handling precisely salvation and therefore its absence, damnation, which is where I started. If the Lord was handling demons, we're doing the same. And if we're handling demons, we're handling their place of abode, hell. And therefore, it must be seen that that is not part of the intelligent equation and must never be talked of. And no parish mission, which the demons hate when they're done properly, must ever talk of it. So, what is the result? People will never be challenged, and it will be assumed, as it is assumed by now, that a funeral is a beatification, no matter who is going into the ground. This is all very different from what happened before. All good priests were aware of it, and every good pastor was a fisher of souls. There was the case amongst a million of Father Patrick, an Oratorian in London, who was a lover of souls and would not let one escape through his hands. He would go through all the hospitals in the area and look out for the initials RC. And when he was there, he would quietly talk before the person expired in the ears of the suffering man or woman. He found one day, and immediately found a negative reaction, and was told in no uncertain terms there was no point in hanging around there. Go away. He wouldn't. The person was puzzled and insisted there was no point in staying. He was wasting his time. he wouldn't go away. He insisted again that he'd better go away or he would regret it. With that, he just looked at him. He became uncomfortable and asked, "What are you looking at?" "I'm looking at you, my dear friend. I'm looking into your eyes, because never, ever before have I looked into the eyes of a person who's going to hell." And with that he turned and went towards the door. As he got to it, the end of the corridor, he just heard a faint, "Father, come back a sec." He came back, heard his confession, and the person died in a state of grace.
Praise God.